I never thought I'd tell this story, mostly because for most of my life, I didn't think I had a story worth telling. My name is Daniel Crawford, and if you know that last name, it's probably because of my father, Senator Richard Crawford. For 40 years, he's been one of the biggest names in Washington, grinning in front of cameras, shaking hands with presidents, and making sure the Crawford family stayed carved into the stone walls of American politics. But no one knew me. I was the oldest son, the one who always seemed to fade into the background. If you've ever lived in someone else's shadow, you'll understand how it feels. My younger brother, Nathan, was the star. He was groomed for the spotlight from the day he could talk. Charismatic, confident, able to light up a room just by walking in. My father adored him, my mother spoiled him, and the world seemed to bend for him. And me, I was the quiet one, the studious one, the one who kept his head down and did the work no one noticed. While Nathan shook hands with donors, I drafted the speeches. While Nathan smiled for cameras, I sat behind a desk, making sure the facts lined up. He was the face. I was the ghost. People think being the overlooked son of a powerful family means you get away with freedom. They're wrong. It doesn't feel like freedom. It feels like being erased while still standing in the same room. That became clearer than ever on the day Nathan was sworn into Congress. The Capitol building was alive with flashing cameras and booming voices, the kind of scene Nathan thrived in. Reporters swarmed around him, hungry for quotes. My parents were glowing, their smiles wide and practiced. And me? I was wedged in the back row, behind junior staffers and interns, as if I didn't even belong to the family whose name I carried. I didn't complain. I never did. I wore my suit, clapped when I was supposed to, and tried to ignore the hollow pit that had become a permanent part of me. After the ceremony, the reception was held in one of those glittering hotel ballrooms in D.C. The chandeliers sparkled, the champagne flowed, and Nathan stood at the center of it all, shaking hands with lobbyists and donors, already acting like he owned the city. My father clapped him on the back and said, "This is just the beginning, son. You'll take the Crawford legacy further than I ever could." I was close enough to hear it, close enough to see my father's pride as he looked at Nathan, the son who could do no wrong. Later that night, I stepped outside to breathe, to get away from the suffocating noise. That's when I heard it, my father's voice, low but distinct, as he spoke to a small group of donors smoking cigars by the fountain. "Daniel, he's useful behind the scenes, but Nathan is the legacy. Daniel was never meant to carry the Crawford name forward. Some people just aren't cut out for leadership." I froze. It wasn't that I didn't know how he felt about me. I'd always known. But hearing it out loud, hearing him dismiss me like a background character in my own family, hit differently. I stood there in the cold, letting the words sink in, trying to swallow the bitterness rising in my throat. That was the night everything shifted. Because not long after, as I walked back toward the hotel, a man stepped out of the shadows and into my path. He was older, maybe in his 70s, wearing a worn coat that had seen better years. His face was lined, his eyes sharp despite his age. "You're Daniel Crawford, aren't you?" he asked. I hesitated. "Yes. Do I know you?" "No," he said, reaching into his coat. "But I knew your father. I knew the man he destroyed." I tensed, unsure whether to walk away or call security. But then he pulled out a folder, thick, heavy, stuffed with papers yellowed at the edges. He pressed it into my hands before I could react. "Everything you've been denied is in there," he said quietly. "Your father's lies, his sins, the truth about who you really are. I spent my life chasing the story, but time's run out for me. It's your turn now." And just like that, he turned and walked away, swallowed by the D.C. night. I stood there, folder in hand, my heart pounding. I should have tossed it. I should have dismissed him as some bitter old man with conspiracy theories. But the weight of that folder felt heavier than paper had any right to be. Back in my apartment later, I finally opened it. What I saw inside changed everything I thought I knew about my family, about myself, about the Crawfords. There were documents, military records, court transcripts, letters, and bank statements. And one phrase kept repeating in my head as I read through them, hour after hour into the night. "Your father is not the man he says he is. And you are not who you think you are." That was the beginning of the end for the Crawford dynasty, and the beginning of my revenge. When I woke up the next morning, the folder was still sitting on the table like some kind of loaded weapon. I hadn't slept. I spent most of the night flipping through the documents, then stopping, then going back again, as if maybe the words would change the second time around. They didn't. The first set of papers were military records. My father had always bragged about his decorated service, the campaigns he fought in, the medals he received. Those stories were woven into his political career, like scripture. Richard Crawford, the decorated veteran who came home and dedicated his life to public service. But the folder showed something else entirely. The dates didn't match. The signatures were forged. One report suggested that not only had my father never seen combat, but he'd also been accused of falsifying service claims. Someone else had been court-martialed in his place, an officer named Samuel Hayes. The file detailed how Hayes lost everything: his career, his pension, his reputation. My father built his empire on another man's ruin. The second set of documents was worse. Bank transfers, offshore accounts, hush payments. They tied my father to shell companies and quiet payoffs, things he'd always been careful to deny publicly. The kind of evidence that would make headlines overnight, the kind of evidence that could destroy a career. But what stopped me cold was the third set of documents: birth records, legal papers, letters. At first, I couldn't process what I was reading. According to these documents, my mother had once been involved with another man, a federal judge named William Harrington. There were photographs of them together, letters he'd written to her, affectionate, intimate. Then came the kicker: a copy of my birth certificate, with his name scribbled in the original draft before it was amended. I wasn't Richard Crawford's biological son. For 30 years, I'd lived my life as the senator's eldest child, only to learn that the man I called Dad wasn't my father at all. I sat there in silence for a long time, the city buzzing outside my window while my world cracked apart. At first, I thought it must be fake, some elaborate setup by a bitter old journalist with too much time on his hands. But then I found something else in the folder: a trust deed. The deed was in my name. William Harrington, before his death, had established a trust that transferred properties, bonds, and assets to me, his son. It had been buried under legal layers, so deep it took me hours to even understand it. But the final line was clear enough. I was the sole heir to a fortune that had been hidden from the Crawfords for decades. And suddenly, it all made sense. The way my father always kept me at arm's length. The way he never showed me pride. Never let me stand in the light beside Nathan. Maybe he always suspected I wasn't his. Maybe he knew all along. I thought about my childhood then, about the years of small cuts that had shaped me. The times I'd waited for him to show up at my debate competitions, only for him to send an aide instead. The time he told me to stop embarrassing the family with books when I got a scholarship to law school instead of a sports award like Nathan. The way he'd look at me across the dinner table, not with hate, but with something colder, indifference. And now I knew why. He had been raising another man's son, and he'd never forgiven me for it. But here was the twist he hadn't counted on. The man he tried to erase had left me more power than the Crawfords could ever dream of. By the second night, I was staring at the folder again, a storm building inside me. I had leverage now. Real leverage. The truth about my father's fraud. The inheritance of a judge who had more friends and influence than any senator. And the trust of people my father had destroyed, like Samuel Hayes's family. For the first time in my life, I wasn't powerless. Still, I didn't act immediately. I couldn't. I needed to be sure. So I made my first move carefully. I called in a favor from an old law school friend who now worked in a federal clerk's office. I asked her to pull sealed records on William Harrington's estate. She hesitated, but a day later, she confirmed it. The trust was real, the assets were real, and my name was listed as beneficiary. That night, I went to see Samuel Hayes's family. I didn't announce who I was at first. I just introduced myself as someone who had once worked in Washington and wanted to pay respects to a man who had been wronged. His widow, frail but sharp-eyed, invited me in. She told me about the day her husband was court-martialed, how they lost their home, how the children grew up under the shadow of shame. He always swore it was a setup, she said, her voice trembling. He always said he was covering for someone else, but no one ever believed him. I believed him. Before I left, I slipped an envelope into her hand. Inside was a check. It wasn't much compared to what she deserved, but it was a start. Her hand shook as she opened it, tears filling her eyes. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. I looked at her, thinking of all the years my father had spent building his empire on lies, and all the years I'd spent invisible in that shadow. "Because it's time someone made things right," I said quietly. As I walked back into the night, the folder heavy in my briefcase, I knew one thing for certain. I couldn't go back to being invisible. Not now. Not ever again. For the first time in my life, the power wasn't in their hands. It was in mine, and I was going to use it. When you grow up invisible, you learn patience. You learn to listen while others talk, to watch while others play their games. What nobody realizes is that the quiet one, the forgotten one, is usually the one who sees everything. I had spent my whole life watching. Now it was time to act. The first step was simple: control the narrative. My father's political machine thrived on image, his decorated military career, his spotless record, the flawless family legacy. I had in my hands the truth that could crack all of it wide open, but dropping it carelessly would only get me burned. I needed to dismantle him slowly, piece by piece, until the Crawfords had no ground left to stand on. The second step was resources. That part, thanks to William Harrington, was already in place. My inheritance was real. My law school friend confirmed it with documents she risked her career to send me. Bonds, property trusts, offshore accounts, ironclad and untouchable. I wasn't rich, I was powerful. The kind of powerful my father thought only he could be. The third step was allies. Not the fake kind. The donors and glad-handers who cheered when the champagne flowed. Real allies. People with stakes, with grudges, with reasons to see Richard Crawford fall. That's where Samuel Hayes's family came in. I didn't show them everything at first. I didn't tell them who I really was. Instead, I began small, setting up scholarship funds for his grandchildren, paying off the last of the widow's debts. Quietly, anonymously, in the beginning. I needed them to trust the help before they trusted me. But soon, I knew I'd have to reveal the truth. Because Samuel Hayes' story wasn't just personal, it was the weapon I needed. Meanwhile, life in the Crawford household went on as if nothing had changed. My father strutted across television screens. Nathan glowed with his new title, and my mother played the role of loyal wife and doting mother. They invited me to events, of course, always as an afterthought. Always the older son, standing quietly in the background, while Nathan soaked in the applause. I went, not because I wanted to, but because I needed to see it. Needed to study the cracks forming in their carefully constructed empire. And the cracks were there, even if they didn't notice them yet. One night, at a private dinner, I watched Nathan corner a donor and drunkenly promise legislation he had no authority to guarantee. My father pulled him aside, not to correct him, but to laugh, as if reckless arrogance was just youthful charm. I stood nearby, sipping water, remembering every word. I wasn't angry anymore. That surprised me. For years, anger had lived inside me like a slow-burning coal. But now, with the truth in my hands, the anger was gone. What replaced it was colder, sharper. A quiet certainty. Revenge wasn't about rage. It was about justice. Balance. The real turning point came when I visited my father's office late one evening under the pretense of dropping off legal briefs. He wasn't there, but his secretary, tired and distracted, left me unattended for a few minutes, long enough for me to slip inside. His desk was immaculate, as always, but I knew where to look. Behind the framed photo of Nathan, shaking hands with the president, was a locked drawer. The same kind of drawer I'd seen him hide things in when I was a boy. A thin hairpin and steady fingers did the rest. Inside were more bank statements, more evidence of shell companies. But there was something else, a list of names. Men and women in Washington who owed him favors, some of them from decades ago. It was his ledger of leverage, proof that Richard Crawford had never risen on merit, but on blackmail and betrayal. I didn't take the papers. Not yet. But I photographed every page, with a hidden pen camera I'd purchased weeks before. When I left his office that night, I knew the foundation of his empire wasn't stone. It was sand, and I had the tide at my command. Still, I wasn't ready to strike. Not yet. I wanted them comfortable. I wanted them smiling. I wanted Nathan so certain of his invincibility that he never saw the cliff's edge until he was already falling. So I played my role. The quiet son, the family shadow, the dutiful older brother who clapped when Nathan gave speeches and posed for photos, just out of frame. But in the shadows, I was building. I reached out to Harrington's old contacts, the ones still alive, still loyal. Some were judges, some were retired politicians, some were simply wealthy friends who never forgot his kindness. One by one, I let them know that his true heir was here, and ready to step into his legacy. Most were surprised. A few were suspicious. But all of them listened. Harrington's name still carried weight, even in death. And now, by extension, so did mine. One evening, sitting alone in my apartment, I spread everything across the table. The documents, the photographs, the trust papers, the ledger from my father's desk. It was like staring at a map of a battlefield. And for the first time in my life, I realized I wasn't the forgotten son. I was the one holding all the pieces. The Crawfords had built an empire on lies, and I was going to be the one to burn it down, quietly, patiently, until all that was left was the truth, and the truth would be mine. I'd spent months building the net, quietly, patiently, until every piece was ready. By the time Nathan's Senate announcement rolled around, I had everything in place, the evidence, the witnesses, the journalists, the timing. It was almost poetic. The same family that had always overlooked me was about to stand under the brightest light they'd ever sought, and that light was going to burn them. The plan hinged on one thing: exposure in daylight. No backroom whispers, no midnight rumors. I wanted undeniable truth, in front of everyone they cared about. I worked with Mara Voss, an investigative journalist who still believed in digging for facts instead of headlines. She had my father's ledger, the falsified service records, the trust documents Harrington had left for me. Her article would drop the morning of Nathan's big speech. I also had affidavits signed by Harrington's old clerks and a retired judge who authenticated everything. This wasn't gossip. It was evidence. At the same time, I arranged something quieter, but just as deadly. The widow of Samuel Hayes wrote an op-ed, her words bleeding pain and dignity. She didn't need to exaggerate. The truth was enough. The night before the fundraiser, I barely slept. I wasn't nervous. I was steady. Revenge wasn't about rage anymore. It was about balance. At 8 in the morning, Mara's piece went live. The headline alone was a knife. The soldier who wasn't. The Crawford family's hidden betrayal. It laid everything bare. My father's lies, the hush money, the falsified records, Samuel Hayes' downfall. Within an hour, the story was everywhere. Networks, social feeds, phone screens buzzing in every political office in the city. By evening, the hotel ballroom was buzzing. Donors in tailored suits glanced at their phones, whispering behind wine glasses. Nathan stood under the chandelier with his practiced grin, pretending not to notice the shifting mood. My father sat at the front table, jaw tight, eyes scanning the room. Nathan began his speech, but halfway through, a projection screen meant to display his campaign logo lit up with scrolling excerpts from Mara's article. Somehow, the wrong file had been queued, or maybe someone on the inside had decided to jump ship. The words falsified records and ledger of payments glowed across the room like a scarlet banner. The silence that followed was brutal. Some donors stood and walked out without a word. Cameras flashed. My father's face, for the first time in my life, was stripped of confidence. He looked small. The next week was chaos. Hearings opened. Committees demanded records. Donors fled. Nathan's campaign collapsed in slow motion. He tried to act indignant, but every press conference only fueled the fire. And me? I stepped forward. I held my own press conference and told the truth. I am Daniel Crawford, I said. I'm not here to enjoy this. I'm here because a man named Samuel Hayes was destroyed to build a career based on lies. These documents are real. These signatures are verified. And justice is long overdue. The room erupted. But this time, The story wasn't about my father's empire. It was about Samuel Hayes, about the family that had been crushed and forgotten. Days later, my father resigned. No grand speech, just a letter citing personal reflection. Nathan went silent, his ambitions broken. My mother called me, her voice trembling, begging me not to destroy what was left. But it wasn't destruction I wanted. It was truth. With Harrington's trust, I founded the Hayes Justice Fund. Scholarships for Hayes's grandchildren. Legal aid for families betrayed by corruption. Grants for journalists who still believed in truth. Every dollar was a quiet correction to years of lies. Sometimes, people asked me if I felt triumphant. I didn't. Triumph is loud. What I felt was quieter, a balance restored, a weight finally lifted. For years, I had been invisible, the forgotten son. But in the end, invisibility was my greatest weapon. I had watched, learned, and waited. And when the time came, I didn't shout. I simply turned on the lights. If you enjoyed this story about discovering your true worth and finding where you really belong, please give this video a thumbs up. It really helps other people find these stories of triumph over family betrayal. Share it with anyone who needs to hear that their worth isn't determined by those who refuse to see it. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss our next story. Drop a comment below telling me what you would have done if you discovered your entire life was built on lies. Would you forgive or would you take your revenge? I read every single comment, and your thoughts inspire our next stories. Until next time, remember, sometimes the best revenge is becoming everything they said you never could.